All right, hi guys. So we were in charge of looking at human rights and social justice issues that affect American Indians and the Native American cultures. I myself, Ashley, and a few others participated in this, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
I'm Nevi.
I'm Lauren.
All right, we're gonna start out with a quick video.
They were the first people ever to live in North America. Exactly when they came and how they arrived is still a mystery. But many scientists believe that as long as 30,000 years ago, some hunters from Asia walked or sailed along the coast of a land bridge that once connected Russia to Alaska. Their descendants became known as Native Americans or American Indians. As they spread out over the vast continent, Native Americans adapted to living in different regions, and hundreds of unique cultures were born. The Plains Indians hunted buffalo by stampeding them over cliffs. On the northern Pacific coast, tribes like the Haida and the Kwakiutl sailed the ocean and fished. They cut down giant red cedar trees for their houses, dug out canoes, and ceremonial totem poles. When the first white settlers arrived in the 1500s, about 1 million Native Americans lived north of Mexico. But the outsiders changed everything. Diseases from Europe, such as smallpox and tuberculosis, wiped out entire tribes. Settlers began to claim Indian land for themselves. Some tribes resisted and fought back. Others attempted to cooperate. In the end, the result was the same. In the late 1800s, the U.S. government forced the remaining Indians to leave their traditional homelands and live on tracts of land called reservations. Over the next century, Native Americans continued to fight for their rights through political activism.
We were told that our religion was wrong. We were told right before our faces that we were heathens. But no more. We're going to take this.
Today, there are more than 550 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. Native Americans are working to improve living conditions on the reservations and to preserve their languages, religions, and cultural identities. The potlatch, a religious ceremony that was once banned by the Canadian government, is being held again by the Kwakiutl. On the Navajo reservation, some ancient ways are blended into modern lives. This sand painting depicts the Cloud People. It's being created to pray for the safety of a group traveling by airplane. Other Native American artists are reviving their tribe's traditional art forms, a movement which could help these unique cultures survive into the next century.
So I've got my essay written and I've been working.
All right. So that was just kind of a quick introduction video to show a little bit about the Native American culture and history that, not a lot of people know about. And I will pass it off to Nevi so she can talk about one of the first things that we are seeing that's affecting this culture of people. Hold on, she's muted.
All right. The first thing we're going to talk about is voting rights for Native Americans. Ashley, can you?
Yep, I got it. There we go.
The first thing we're going to talk about is the Dawes Act of 1887. In 1887, the Congress passed the Dawes Act. One second. Can we move our camera?
Yeah, I just did.
Oh, I have to move mine. Hold on. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act. The act gave Congress the power to divide Indian reservations into separate allotments over which the government held a 25-year trusteeship. The Dawes Act attempted to force assimilation and separation of Native Americans from their land and break their unity. The next act we're going to talk about is the Snyder Act of 1924. Citizenship among Native Americans was limited prior to the Snyder Act, and Native Americans were not allowed to vote. The Indian Citizenship Act was passed by Congress in 1924. The Indian Citizenship Act was also referred to as the Snyder Act. The proponent of the act was Homer Snyder, who was a New York representative at that time. Citizenship among Native Americans was limited to this, and Native Americans were not allowed to vote. After the signing and the enactment of the Indian American Citizenship Act of 1924, and other events that were meant to give Native Americans freedom and rights, most Native Americans were not enjoying some of the rights. The most important right that was subject to this issue was the right to vote. Native Americans were denied the right to vote, and the Constitution allowed each state to decide who had the right to vote. And now we're going to watch a short video.
For Native Americans, some might say the road to equality in the U.S. has been one of the toughest battles in its past. Historically, the relationship between Native Americans and the white European settlers has shifted between paternalistic to oppressive. Rights were trampled, land was taken, and they were told to assimilate, supposedly to protect Indian property rights. Even though Native Americans had preceded Americans on U.S. soil, by the mid-1920s, still only about 2/3 of Native Americans were considered U.S. citizens. Some, through marriage, military service, or allotments from the Dawes Act of 1887, were. But in order to continue to assimilate them into white America, while allowing them to maintain their tribal traditions, President Calvin Coolidge passed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 on June 2nd, granting citizenship to all Native Americans born in the U.S. But even then, Native Americans would continue to battle for their rights. Some states continued to deny them. But their battle was won when New Mexico finally granted citizenship in 1962. For Native
The voting barriers Native Americans face today, despite the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, many Native Americans live on reservations, continue to be excluded from the democratic process. Voting rights continue to be a challenge through the passage of new laws and practices that either fail to consider, disregard, or intentionally target Native American voters.
Welcome back. While voting rights for all Americans, including Native Americans, are taking center stage at the federal level, the Native American Voting Rights Act is supposed to help undo decades of voter suppression. Vanessa Misiagna went to Navajo Nation to see what this passage of act would mean so much.
Native Americans have contributed great things to this country, our freedoms, and even to democracy all around the world.
Beneath Window Rock on Navajo Nation, a memorial is dedicated to the code talkers of World War II, Navajo soldiers who used their native tongue to create an uncrackable secret cipher.
If it wasn't for the Navajo code talkers, we would have not won World War II.
President of Navajo Nation, Jonathan Nez, is proud of everything his people have contributed to the United States, despite everything that's been taken away. That is why he believes it is only right to make sure the voices of the Navajo and the other 574 Native tribes are heard.
We need the federal government, once again, to fulfill their obligation and to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples here in this country, and that includes voting. It should be easier.
It's by standing in Navajo Nation that one can begin to truly feel the reach of the land. Located in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, it is more than 27,000 square miles and is the largest Native American reservation in the country. It's even bigger than the state of West Virginia. Getting around in general can be difficult, but navigating to a ballot box for many is nearly impossible.
The truth is, Native Americans have to travel sometimes over 100 miles to get to a ballot box. That's crazy.
Jacqueline DeLeon is an attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting injustices against Native communities. She says that distance is not the only setback to voting in Indian country. Many homes don't have addresses, making voting by mail tough, and some only speak their native languages. An act is up for debate on the federal level that will help bring down those unique barriers.
It creates a federal mandate that there has to be polling places on the reservation. And it also means that there are accommodations for things like people that don't have addresses and gets them ways that they can register to vote.
What DeLeon is talking about is the Native American Voting Rights Act, which is right now being included in the larger John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It would also make tribal ID cards viable for voting purposes, and it will create a task force to keep tabs on inequities. Though some politicians have said this act will only open the door to voter fraud, the Native American Voting Rights Act has bipartisan support, and hope is high that it will pass. For President Jonathan Nez, this means giving his people a chance to be heard that they may never have gotten before.
Will protect the Native American vote into the future, not just for us right now, but for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations to come.
I'm Vanessa Bashani reporting.
Registering to vote online or driving somewhere to register to vote or voting itself can be logistically challenging, if not economically infeasible. In Arizona, the lack of residential addresses resulted in registered voters having their ID cards rejected at the polls, while county offices may offer in-person voter registration during normal business hours. This can be challenging for more Native Americans who may live 100 miles or more from the county seat. And for some Native Americans and Alaska Natives, oral translations must be provided for voter registration and voting. And here is just a little flyer that I found on Native American and voting rights that you guys can take a look at.
All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is going to be looking at like the COVID effects of the Native American population. Because honestly, that's a big impact right now in their communities. So a little bit of background information. So the Native Americans and the federal government are in what they call a trust relationship. And so that is the responsibility for a variety of services and benefits to be provided to the Indian people, you know, by the federal government or their state government. And one of the big things that this includes is their healthcare. There's treaties between the US government and the Indian tribes. And on a daily and monthly basis, like they are constantly visited and revised based upon the inequality of those responsibilities. There's an IHS, which is the Indian Health System or Indian Health Services, which is what provides healthcare to Indians on Indian reservations. But there's not a lot of funding that goes to that, and we'll see that in just a little bit. A couple of cases that I want to bring up. There was a Supreme Court case between the Cherokee tribe versus Georgia in 1831, and this was simply a case that addressed the relationship between the tribes, the states, and the federal government, and what that was supposed to look like, and how, you know, because they were here, how can the US government, even though we're taking all the land from them, how can we still create this relationship where we provide them stuff because we have taken things from them? And then there's the Snyder Act of 1921. So this actually is the act that goes before the one that Navi just talked about. But this is specifically looking at the legislative authority for Congress to appropriate funds specifically for the healthcare of the Indian people. Which in our current situation, there's a lot of belief that still to this day that Native Americans and even Alaskan Americans are not considered citizens, which impacts their voting rights as well, which also impacts their ability to not be considered eligible for state programs or benefits. So they're lacking that ability to get state funding for healthcare or for food or anything like that that, you know, a US citizen has access to. And just taking kind of a quick look at like the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, it's affected the Native American population on many different levels. So there's been inadequate testing. They have not been able to accurately test. A statistic that I found that they have only done 27,000 tests on Native Americans, and that was as of June of 2021. And so there's over 500,000 Native Americans still in the US, and we've only been able to test 27,000 of them, and roughly 3,000 of them have come back positive. Because of the funding situation, there's shortages on like personal protective equipment and medical supplies that's needed to be able to properly handle the COVID-19 situations in their local hospitals that are on the reservations and things like that. Another big one is, you know, because they usually live in such close quarters with multiple family members. So not only their mom and their dad and their siblings, but most of the time aunt, uncles, cousins, and even grandparents. And so sometimes they cannot social distance because it's not something that's viable for them to do. But also it relays in with they can't use proper hygiene due to many other aspects of living on reservations when you look at like water shortages and things like that. Another thing is that Native Americans already have higher chronic diseases like diabetes, heart conditions. And so it just puts them at a greater risk to be vulnerable for the COVID-19 virus that's floating around, which then in turn, if the staffing at medical facilities cannot handle the situation, it just impacts them more. And then one of the things that really shocked me, which kind of will go into a segment that I talk about later, is that the elders are passing away at alarming rates. So the majority of their people are elders, you know, and those are the most vulnerable, which those are the ones that are contracting it and passing away, whether that's from their chronic disease or the complications from COVID on top of their chronic disease. But the problem with this is that it's dissolving their language and it's dissolving their traditions and the knowledge to be passed down to the next set of generations. And I saw this was actually from Abigail Eco Hawk, and she is a Native American young woman living up in the Washington, Oregon area. And she says the system of colonialism in the United States has created and continues to increase risk factors for poor health outcomes in Native communities. She's a young girl trying to make a voice for the Native American, communities and tribes, and we have to help support her. And this is just a couple things that showed up. So one of those is a data point of American Indians and Alaskan Native people within certain states and how COVID has impacted them. So specifically looking at like the Navajo region, because that's Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming, which is where they are. Arizona's had an 18% death, but there has been a higher population of percentage of cases and within those nations. And then I thought this was really interesting to have this picture of, the social distancing key, because it's saying social distance is beautiful, close to what matters and saves lives, distance to get too close. So this was kind of one of their Centers for American Indian Health, kind of like our CDC is posters that were being posted around communities just to spread awareness. All right, Lauren, I'll pass it off to you.
All right, I'm going to start by talking about the inadequate health and mental health care that Native Americans receive. Okay, so healthcare. They actually live in poor health conditions and actually have limited access to healthcare facilities. Healthcare disparity has led to higher rates of obesity, diabetes, HIV, and AIDS in Native Americans. And actually, care that they receive lags severely behind other groups. They also have a life expectancy that is 4.4 years less than all other races and ethnicities in the US population. They die at a higher rate of in many preventable illnesses such as chronic liver disease and cirrhosis, diabetes, and chronic lower respiratory diseases. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indian Health Service. So the IHS was actually supposed to provide healthcare to Native Americans, established in 1955. However, it is severely underfunded by, and it is forcing hospital administrators to limit their services offered to Native Americans. And of this, they lack basic amenities to provide quality and excellent healthcare services. The IHS provides care to over 2.2 million Native Americans across the country. However, Congress looks at it that they're fulfilling the responsibilities of the treaty that said that they were responsible to provide health care for members of more than 560 tribes. All right, for mental health care. So Native Americans live in what's considered to be stressful environments, and they do not go out to seek mental help because they do not trust white practitioners, especially after the land grab. So for Native Americans, suicide is actually the second leading cause of death for them between the ages of 10 and 34, which is a huge age range. And access to mental health is difficult due to economic, societal, and regional barriers. Okay. Now for law enforcement. Okay, so they actually have a few different law enforcement. So a new phenomenon for them is actually having tribal police departments on the reservations. And they also are policed by local and state agencies, and this has caused many jurisdictional issues between all three police departments, and it's actually caused Native Americans to suffer in higher rates of fatal encounters with. So, as I mentioned, they suffer a lot of from violence due to this jurisdictional issue. And sadly, there's not a whole lot of reliable data about Native Americans and police violence. And actually, at one point in history, they were at a higher rate of being killed by police officers than any other race or ethnic group. And then here are some stats over groups more likely to be killed by law enforcement. And as you can see, Native Americans are pretty high up on the list.
Yeah, and to kind of tag on to this, this one was for year 1999 to 2011, but this one's a more recent one of 2012. And our, American Indians or Alaskan Natives have a much higher rate at being killed by law enforcement or involved in some sort of race or policing issue compared to what most people think of as like the African American race or the Latino race. So that was very eye-opening when looking for statistics that backed up, what Lauren had talked about.
Okay, so for the court system. So for past injustices, the U.S. relationship with tribal nations is rooted in the treaty relationship. And this treaty relationship was actually made through about 800 treaties with different tribes. And actually, all tribes involved in the were actually violated by the US in some way. So in 1828, Native Americans went to the Supreme Court trying to seek justice after their land was taken from them. And what I found very interesting was that the Supreme Court stated that the land domination that was taken by Americans laid the groundwork for future domination, and the land left that was left was that they had left was actually taking power of Congress and the courts, and pretty much told them that they weren't getting their land back, that nothing was wrong and no laws were violated. And then the plenary power doctrine is when Congress presumes for itself that it had absolute power over indigenous people and their resources, even though they never received any consent from any of the tribes. So present injustices. So the trust doctrine and land ownership, actually Native Americans do not hold title to their lands. The federal government actually holds the Aboriginal title in a trust on the behalf of Native Americans, and they only have the right to occupy the land, but do not have full ownership rights like what we would have of owning our house or any type of property. Social disruptions. So the United States gradual process of domination has led to profound social disruptions that still affect tribal communities. So some forms that have taken place are poverty, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, disproportionately high health problems, substandard education and healthcare. According to the treaty history, the United States is responsible for the healthcare and education of Native Americans. However, in order to access government healthcare and education, they must show proof of their affiliation with tribal nations, which is where the blood quantum and identity comes into place. So the federal government imposed criteria that classify Native Americans based on their tribe that they belong to, instead of their race or what faction they belong to, based on whether they were on their status as a member or citizen of their tribal nation. Oh, do you want to go back? Okay.
Okay.
No problem. So Native American tribes are actually free to establish their own criteria. But since the blood quantum model was forced on them, that's actually what they still use today. And the federal government still uses this model for their benefit programs.
And before we go on, so like I actually just want to tie this to several of the universal doctrines that we've looked at for human rights. And there are multiple rights that are currently still being violated for the Native Americans. If you look at like Article 25 is talking about like the standard of living, like an adequate standard of living for like health and well-being of himself and the family. You know, they are living in poor conditions. They don't have adequate health care. Another one that stuck out to me was Article, I think it was 16. Article 26, which is like the right to education, which kind of goes within that like blood quantum and identity. You know, they're not given the adequate education, and most of the time they have to stay on the reservation in order to get that education, because they cannot go or have the means to travel to like the local surrounding, public schools or things like that fall outside of the reservation line. So, I mean, there's a lot of like human rights violations that are still happening for the Native Americans. And even like tying it in with the video about the Dakota 38, I mean, a lot of those, if you listen to what a lot of those Dakota people talked about, they said that, they felt uncomfortable in the white person's home. Like, even though they were not the ones to experience, what happened to the Dakota tribe in 1863 or 1862, like they still are impacted by that, and it leaves that mark, of history and culture. So, all right, Lauren, sorry. Had to tie that in there.
So for the incarceration rate. So a lot of the data that I found for the incarceration rate of Native Americans was from like 2010 to 2016. They really didn't have anything new. So this may be a little outdated. So in 2010, from census data, there was a total of 37,854 Native American adults in correctional facilities. And of those, 32,534 were males and 5,032 were women. And actually 198 of them were youth that were 17 and younger. So for prison data, 22,744 Native Americans were incarcerated in the U.S. State and federal prisons. Of those, 19,970 were men and 2,954 were women. And the article actually stated that the number of Native Americans being arrested during this time was growing considerably. So for jail data, 9,700 Native Americans were being held in jails all across the country, and 80 facilities were operating on tribal land, and they were holding 2,540 people, and of those, 1,750 were men and 620 were women, and then 6% of that population were 17 or younger.
Yeah, and to tie in with that Dakota 38 video, guys, I mean, if you listen to a lot of them said like their younger siblings or their older siblings were sitting in jail cells or things like that. And so I wonder too sometimes if that is something that is caused by inadequate trial and not being given a fair trial, and kind of going in, well, does the tribal police or the local police, who then takes over, which then that affects essentially potentially who what that trial looks like for that Native American individual.
And so the data that I found on youth, so actually 42% of the population for Native Americans is those that are actually under the age of 21, and they have a detention rate of 255 per 1,000 people. And that's all I could really find about youth incarceration on Native Americans.
All right, and then I'm going to kind of finish talking it off about just a few other issues, and even just some repetitive issues that we've talked about. So essentially, here's just kind of a few issues that impacts our Native American culture. So they have fewer education opportunities. They actually have fewer graduation rates, and their dropout rates are only increasing due to treatment. Only 19% of the entire Native American population is enrolled in college, and that's looking at kids, youth, adolescents, ages 18 to 24. And this picture over here on the side is from a news article from Newport, Washington, but they were actually talking about how the federal government was coming in and making arrangements to send the reservation kids to public schools because the federal government was wanting to take over part of that land and use it for a different aspect. And so they do have fewer education opportunities because of this, right? And so that impacts them. So native language, disappearing, only 175 out of the 300 native languages actually remain today. And, you know, a lot of that is because funding, you cannot get funding to find somebody to educate people on the native languages. And also COVID has impacted this with like the elderlies, you know, passing away at faster rates than, you know, probably necessary, which overall is a huge thing. Kind of going off what Lauren talked about earlier was like the limited financial institutions. So the lands that they live on, they do not own. They are held in trust by the federal government. So they really don't have anything of value to put up as leverage to get loans for other businesses or, you know, things that could essentially impact them to be successful and, you know, create a successful line for the next set of generations. A big one that's happening and will continue to happen is their natural resource exploitation. So the native lands, if you think about, you know, the Arizona, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, some of like Nebraska and things like that are used for, they have a lot of natural resources, gold, oil, timber, gas. And so the Indian lands, again, because they don't own them, the federal government can lease out contracts for people to come in and take whatever they feel necessary to ensure that, you know, those are being used crisis, which then ultimately sends us into that climate crisis that they focus on, you know, because of those, it's impacting the climate of taking the timber and drilling for oil is impacting the overall climate of the land that they live on. And the next one, the last one was like violence against women and children. So 46% of all Native American women, okay, that's huge. That's almost over half, like that is almost half of like the entire like Native American population. Women have been impacted by some form of physical violence, whether that's physical abuse, rape, trafficked, you know, just sexually assaulted. That's a huge number. And so that also impacts their living conditions and their mental health. So all of these things are intertwined together to create that overall of that Native American tribe. I have a couple of like graphs here that just kind of show that. So this first one up here is looking at like the Brecken region or the Bakken region, which is known for its oil. And it's looking at from 2005 to actually 2012, the other image cut it off. But what really like kind of happened to the rate of like victimization per 10,000 people. So that region broke, but then this is where that oil boom started in late 2008. And we only then see an increase in that. Here is an interesting like statistic about, trying to move my thing so you can see it. But like Native American missing women, you know, they're high up. These are the different tribes in different counties. And this is the percentage of missing women within those counties. And then here kind of looks at like purchasing power, you know, over poverty. So Native Americans are low in that buying rate, you know, and they're higher in the victimization as well as the facilitators. So overall, like they are truly impacted in multiple ways, which then impacts all other issues. And I think back to like the previous course of like trauma, you know, trauma informed, like things keep happening and it just keeps building and, you know, it just impacts them. Okay, so our presentation has concluded. So what we're going to ask of you is that when I post this, is that you go into this link right here. It's called the Poll Everywhere, and you're going to have a question, and we're going to create a word cloud. And it can be one word, it can be multiple words. You can do several submissions, but we want to kind of see what your overall just like immediate feeling was for this. And then the last will be a Google form quiz. If you'll click the link here, And then we just ask that you respond with one paragraph of something that you learned from this presentation, something that maybe has impacted your way of thinking, or how you see the situation that involves and wraps around this Native American community, and how we as the younger generation can use our voice to support them. So thank you guys so much for watching our presentation. We really appreciate it, and let us know if you have any questions. Bye guys.